The emergency broadcast crackled through the communications center at Fort Meade at exactly 0347 hours, and Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb knew immediately that this was no ordinary disturbance. The voice on the other end belonged to Officer David Patterson of the Philadelphia Police Department, and the panic bleeding through his normally composed tone made the hairs on Webb's neck stand straight. Patterson was screaming about people eating people, about gunshots that wouldn't stop the attackers, about something impossibly wrong unfolding in the streets of downtown Philadelphia. Webb had served 3 tours overseas, had seen combat in places most Americans couldn't locate on a map, and he had never heard a police officer sound quite so terrified. Within minutes, the Situation Room transformed into controlled chaos as military personnel scrambled to verify the reports flooding in from Pennsylvania. Sergeant Rachel Morrison, a communications specialist with 10 years of experience, coordinated with local authorities while her hands flew across multiple keyboards. Her screens displayed a nightmare of incoming calls, surveillance footage, and emergency services being overwhelmed. What started as isolated incidents in a single neighborhood had spread like wildfire across 3 city blocks in under 20 minutes. Major Kyle Hendricks, the night operations commander, stood behind Morrison with his arms crossed, watching the security camera feeds with growing disbelief. The grainy footage showed people moving with unnatural, jerking motions, their bodies seeming to ignore damage that should have dropped them instantly. "Sir, we have confirmation from multiple sources," Morrison reported without looking away from her monitors. "Philadelphia General Hospital reports patients attacking staff. The victims are displaying extreme aggression, apparent immunity to pain, and they're biting anyone within reach. Local law enforcement has discharged weapons with minimal effect. They're requesting immediate National Guard support." Her voice remained steady, professional, but Webb noticed her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. He didn't blame her. The implications of what they were witnessing defied everything in their training manuals. Major Hendricks grabbed the secure line to the Pentagon, his jaw set in a grim line that Webb had seen before, usually right before everything went straight to hell. While Hendricks briefed the Joint Chiefs, Webb pulled up the tactical maps of Philadelphia, his mind already running through containment scenarios and troop deployments. His years of military strategy had prepared him for conventional threats, terrorist attacks, even chemical weapons, but this situation fell outside any playbook he had ever studied. If the reports were accurate, they were dealing with something that belonged in horror movies, not military briefings. Colonel Janet Reeves arrived in the operations center at 0412 hours, her uniform crisp despite the early hour, her gray eyes sharp and alert. As the senior officer present, she immediately took command, listening to the briefing with an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. Webb had served under Reeves for 2 years and respected her ability to stay ice-cold under pressure, but even she couldn't hide the brief flicker of shock when Morrison played the audio recordings from first responders. The sounds were almost inhuman, growling and screeching mixed with the screams of victims and the staccato burst of police firearms. "Get me Governor Martinez on the line," Reeves ordered, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Activate the Pennsylvania National Guard and put the 101st Airborne on standby. I want helicopter reconnaissance over Philadelphia in 30 minutes and a no-fly zone established for civilian aircraft. Coordinate with the CDC and have them send their rapid response team immediately." She turned to Webb, and he saw the weight of command in her eyes, the terrible burden of making decisions when all the options were bad. "Marcus, prepare contingency plans for a full quarantine of the affected area. If this spreads beyond the current containment line, we'll need to shut down all traffic in and out of the city." As personnel rushed to execute her orders, Webb pulled up population density maps and transportation networks, calculating how quickly an infection could spread through one of America's largest metropolitan areas. The numbers were sobering. Philadelphia held over 1.5 million people, with countless more in the surrounding suburbs. If they couldn't contain this outbreak in its early stages, the death toll could reach catastrophic levels. His computer screen flickered as new reports arrived, each one expanding the affected zone by another block, another street, another neighborhood. The infection was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and somewhere in the back of his mind, Webb wondered if they were already too late. Outside the operations center, the sun was beginning to rise on what would become the longest day in American military history, though none of them knew it yet. The war against the dead had begun. The Pentagon's National Military Command Center hummed with urgent activity by 0600 hours as General Thomas Bradford stood before a wall of screens displaying the deteriorating situation in Philadelphia. Bradford had commanded operations in war zones across the globe, but watching American streets turn into battlefields against an enemy that defied conventional military doctrine sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Defense Secretary Amanda Hutchinson sat at the head of the conference table, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated with the president, while analysts and tactical officers presented data that grew more disturbing by the minute. The infection zone had expanded to cover 12 square miles, and the number of casualties was climbing so rapidly that hospitals had stopped trying to keep accurate counts. Captain Eric Donovan of the Pennsylvania National Guard experienced the reality of the situation firsthand when his convoy rolled into the outskirts of Philadelphia at dawn. His unit had mobilized with impressive speed, soldiers loading into transport vehicles with the efficiency born from countless drills, but nothing in their training had prepared them for what waited in the streets. Donovan's radio crackled with cross-chatter from police units falling back from their positions, their ammunition exhausted and their nerves shattered. Through his vehicle's reinforced windows, he saw his first infected person, a middle-aged man in torn business attire stumbling toward the convoy with a gait that seemed both clumsy and relentless. The man's shirt was soaked in blood, his jaw hung at an unnatural angle, and his eyes held no recognition of the armored vehicles bearing down on the street. "All units, hold fire until we have positive confirmation of hostile intent," Donovan commanded, even as every instinct screamed at him that something was fundamentally wrong with the people shambling toward their position. His rules of engagement were clear: American soldiers didn't fire on American civilians without absolute certainty, but those rules had been written for a world that made sense. Specialist Jennifer Hayes, manning the .50 caliber machine gun on the lead vehicle, watched through her scope as more figures emerged from buildings and alleys, their movements coordinated by nothing but the apparent scent of living flesh. Some were missing limbs, others had wounds that should have been fatal, and all of them were converging on the military convoy with single-minded purpose. The first engagement happened when an infected woman lunged at a soldier during an attempted evacuation of a residential block. Private Lucas Bennett had been helping an elderly couple into a transport truck when the woman, wearing what had once been a nurse's uniform, grabbed his arm with impossible strength and sank her teeth into his forearm before anyone could react. Bennett screamed and instinctively shoved her away, but she came back immediately, heedless of the baton strikes from his fellow soldiers. Sergeant Diana Foster made the split-second decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, raising her sidearm and putting 2 rounds center mass into the attacking woman. The infected nurse staggered but didn't fall, and Foster's training took over, her third shot catching the woman in the head and finally dropping her like a puppet with cut strings. Back at the Pentagon, the implications of the field reports were causing a fundamental shift in military strategy. Colonel Raymond Foster, no relation to Diana, headed the Tactical Planning Division and was rapidly developing new protocols for an enemy that operated under rules no military textbook had ever considered. Standard small arms fire was ineffective unless shots were placed precisely in the head or upper spine. The infected felt no fear, responded to no warnings, and would continue attacking until physically incapable of movement. Worse yet, every person killed by the infected rose within minutes to join their ranks, turning each casualty into a force multiplier for the enemy. Foster's team calculated that without immediate and aggressive containment, the infection could spread beyond Philadelphia within 48 hours. Governor Martinez authorized full evacuation protocols at 0815 hours, and the scope of the operation was staggering. Major Andrew Sullivan coordinated the civilian exodus, establishing checkpoints on all major highways leading out of the city. His team screened evacuees for bite wounds and signs of infection, a process that created massive traffic jams and rising panic among citizens desperate to escape. Sullivan watched a monitor showing aerial footage of Interstate 76, where thousands of cars sat bumper to bumper, honking horns and attempting dangerous maneuvers to move faster. His greatest fear was that infected individuals would hide their wounds to escape the quarantine zone, carrying the contagion to new population centers. As noon approached, Colonel Reeves received authorization for something unprecedented in modern American history, the establishment of a hard perimeter around metropolitan Philadelphia with orders to prevent anyone, infected or not, from crossing the line after the evacuation window closed. The military was about to seal off an entire American city, and every officer involved understood the terrible mathematics of that decision. They would save millions by sacrificing thousands, and the weight of that choice settled on their shoulders like lead. The battle for Philadelphia had truly begun. The quarantine perimeter became a battlefield by 1400 hours, and Lieutenant Jake Morrison watched the defense line take shape with growing dread knotted in his gut. His platoon had established positions along Roosevelt Boulevard, using overturned vehicles and hastily constructed barriers to create a choke point that stretched across 8 lanes of asphalt. Behind them, the last convoys of evacuees streamed toward safety, while ahead, the infected were gathering in numbers that defied belief. Morrison counted at least 300 visible contacts shambling down the boulevard, with more emerging from side streets and buildings with every passing minute. Staff Sergeant Nicole Price checked her ammunition count for the 3rd time, her experienced hands moving automatically while her eyes never left the approaching horde that had once been neighbors, shopkeepers, and families. Colonel Reeves commanded the operation from a mobile command center positioned 3 miles behind the front lines, surrounded by screens showing feeds from dozens of positions around the quarantine zone. The perimeter formed an irregular circle encompassing the infected areas, manned by over 5,000 National Guard troops, active-duty soldiers hastily redeployed from Fort Dix, and Marines from Quantico who had arrived just hours earlier. Major Christina Wells, Reeves's second-in-command, coordinated artillery positions and air support, knowing that the decisions made in the next few hours would determine whether they contained this outbreak or watched it consume the entire eastern seaboard. The latest estimates from the CDC were catastrophic. The infection zone contained approximately 30,000 infected individuals, with the number growing exponentially as the dead overwhelmed the living trapped inside the perimeter. Morrison's radio crackled with the voice of Captain Donovan, who had overall command of the Roosevelt Boulevard sector. All units, weapons free. I repeat, weapons free. Engage only with confirmed headshots. Make every round count. Morrison relayed the order to his soldiers, watching their faces transform from nervous anticipation to grim determination. Private Isabella Rodriguez crossed herself quickly before shouldering her rifle, her sights finding the lead infected person, a teenage boy wearing a blood-soaked football jersey. She hesitated for just a moment, processing the terrible reality that she was about to shoot someone who might have been sitting in a classroom just yesterday, before her training overrode her horror and she squeezed the trigger. The boy dropped, and the battle of the quarantine zone began in earnest. The sound of coordinated rifle fire rolled across the boulevard like thunder as dozens of soldiers opened up simultaneously. Infected individuals fell in clusters, but the mass behind them simply trampled over the bodies and continued forward with that relentless, jerking gait that seemed to mock the military's firepower. Corporal Michael Zhang fired with mechanical precision, dropping targets with almost every shot, but for each infected he eliminated, 2 more seemed to take their place. Morrison realized with sick certainty that they were facing numbers far beyond initial estimates, and the ammunition expenditure rate would become critical long before they ran out of targets. 3 blocks north, Sergeant First Class Patricia Coleman's position faced an entirely different nightmare when infected began emerging from the subway system directly behind their defensive line. Coleman's squad had to execute a fighting retreat, laying down suppressive fire while medic Travis Montgomery helped wounded soldiers fall back to secondary positions. Private Daniel Harper provided covering fire until his rifle ran dry, then drew his combat knife when an infected woman in tattered medical scrubs got too close for him to reload. He drove the blade upward through her jaw with a strength born from pure survival instinct, turning away before her body hit the ground because 3 more were already reaching for him with grasping, blood-caked hands. At 1,545 hours, Major Wells authorized the use of heavy weapons when a section of the perimeter near the airport began to buckle under the weight of infected numbers. Attack helicopters swept in low, their chain guns carving devastating paths through the dense masses of undead, while armored vehicles pushed forward to reinforce the failing line. Lieutenant Ashley Turner commanded one of the Bradley fighting vehicles, her crew coordinating their fire to maximum effect as the 25mm cannon tore through groups of infected with brutal efficiency. The heavy weapons made a difference, but Turner could see the cost in her crew's faces as they processed the reality that they were using military hardware designed for foreign battlefields against American citizens on American soil. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Colonel Reeves reviewed casualty reports that made her heart sink. 43 soldiers dead, over 100 wounded, and worst of all, 17 confirmed bitten and showing early signs of infection. The protocol was clear but unbearable. Infected personnel had to be isolated immediately and humanely neutralized before they turned. Captain Robert Mitchell, the unit chaplain, volunteered to stay with the infected soldiers during their final hours, offering what comfort he could to young men and women who had done their duty and paid the ultimate price. The perimeter was holding, but everyone from Reeves down to the newest private understood the terrible truth. This was only the first day, and the infected never needed to rest, never needed to eat, and never, ever stopped coming. The decision to abandon the inner perimeter came at 0230 hours on day 3, and it was the hardest order Colonel Reeves had ever given in her 22-year military career. The infected numbers had swelled beyond all projections, with estimates now exceeding 90,000 undead wandering the streets of Philadelphia, and the ammunition expenditure rate had reached unsustainable levels. Captain Donovan received the withdrawal order while his exhausted soldiers were fighting off their 6th major assault of the night, and the relief in his voice was unmistakable even as he coordinated the tactical retreat that would cost them 5 miles of hard-won territory. Lieutenant Morrison and his platoon provided rearguard action, laying down suppressive fire while units leapfrogged backward toward new defensive positions established along the Schuylkill River, where the natural barrier would give them a desperately needed advantage. The new strategy focused on consolidation rather than containment, and General Bradford personally oversaw the establishment of Safe Zone Alpha in Westchester, 20 miles from the original outbreak epicenter. The facility transformed from a community college campus into a fortified refuge within 18 hours, with engineers erecting barriers, medical teams setting up triage centers, and logistics personnel organizing supply chains for the 15,000 civilians already sheltered within its walls. Major Kimberly Fletcher commanded safe zone operations, and her organizational skills were tested constantly as new evacuees arrived with stories of narrow escapes and desperate survival. Each newcomer underwent rigorous screening protocols developed by Dr. Gregory Walsh, a CDC virologist who had been studying tissue samples from the infected with growing fascination and horror. Walsh's research team, working in a hastily assembled laboratory within Safe Zone Alpha, had made discoveries that were rapidly changing military tactics on the front lines. The infection appeared to be a variant of a rabies-like virus that spread through bites and bodily fluid contact, with an incubation period ranging from 3 to 8 hours depending on the severity of the wound and the victim's overall health. Once the virus reached the brain, it caused massive cellular death followed by a reanimation of the motor cortex that science couldn't yet fully explain. The reanimated dead required an intact brainstem to function, which explained why headshots were effective, and they were drawn to noise and movement, with fresh blood seeming to drive them into feeding frenzies. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Barnes, serving as liaison between Walsh's team and military command, rushed these findings to every unit in the field, knowing that understanding the enemy was as crucial as having ammunition to fight them. While defensive positions were being reorganized, Captain Eric Donovan volunteered to lead a rescue operation into the red zone to extract survivors reported holed up in a police station near City Hall. His team of 12 hand-picked soldiers moved through the devastated streets with tactical precision, using sound suppressors on their weapons to avoid attracting the massive hordes that had congregated in the downtown area. Specialist Jennifer Hayes walked point, her eyes scanning for movement while her heart hammered against her ribs. The city she was moving through bore little resemblance to the Philadelphia she had visited on leave just 6 months earlier. Abandoned cars sat with doors hanging open, buildings showed signs of fire and violence, and bodies lay everywhere in various states of decay and consumption. The rescue team found 43 survivors in the precinct house, including Officer David Patterson, whose initial call had alerted Fort Meade to the outbreak. Patterson looked like he had aged 10 years in 3 days, his eyes haunted by the things he had witnessed and the colleagues he had lost. Among the survivors were 2 children, siblings named Connor and Emma Phillips, whose parents had barricaded them in the station's holding cells before sacrificing themselves to hold off the infected. Sergeant Diana Foster carried Emma on her back during the extraction, whispering reassurances to the terrified 6-year-old while navigating streets filled with shambling nightmares. The team moved in near silence, using hand signals and carefully planned routes that avoided major concentrations of infected, and when they finally crossed back into secured territory, Donovan felt a surge of pride that cut through his exhaustion. They had saved 43 lives in a situation where every life mattered. Back at the Pentagon, Major Andrew Sullivan presented the Joint Chiefs with a comprehensive analysis of the outbreak's trajectory and potential containment strategies. The infection had stabilized within a roughly 40-square-mile area, held in check by the new defensive perimeter and increasingly effective military tactics. Civilian casualties were estimated at over 60,000 dead or infected, but the evacuation had saved more than 1 million lives, and the military had proven it could fight this enemy to a stalemate. Sullivan's presentation included proposals for offensive operations designed to systematically clear infected zones, using lessons learned from the chaotic first days to develop doctrine for urban combat against the undead. Defense Secretary Hutchinson listened with cautious optimism, recognizing that while the immediate crisis had been managed, the real war was just beginning. For the first time since the outbreak began, however, military leadership believed they could actually win, and that belief spread through the ranks like wildfire, reigniting hope in soldiers who had seen too much death and darkness. Operation Reclamation began at dawn on Day 7, and Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders as he watched the first assault teams move into position. The plan was audacious, some said borderline insane, but 3 days of careful planning and reconnaissance had identified weaknesses in the infected horde that could be exploited with precision and overwhelming force. Webb commanded the Tactical Operations Center alongside Colonel Reeves, monitoring feeds from drone aircraft that circled over Philadelphia's devastated streets like mechanical vultures. The objective was clear: establish a secure corridor from the outer perimeter to City Hall, dividing the infected population and creating zones that could be systematically cleared and reclaimed. Major Kyle Hendricks led the armored spearhead, a column of tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles that rolled down Market Street with engines roaring deliberately loud. The noise was intentional, designed to draw infected away from the flanking routes where infantry teams would advance through cleared buildings. Hendricks watched his tactical display as thousands of infected converged on his position, their primitive brains responding exactly as Dr. Walsh's research had predicted. The column maintained steady forward momentum, crushing infected beneath their treads while gunners eliminated threats with ruthlessly efficient headshots. Corporal Michael Jean operated the main gun on Hendricks's command tank, and the young soldier who had fought desperately on the defensive perimeter now attacked with cold precision, each shot representing hours of training adapted to this new nightmare warfare. 3 blocks north, Captain Jessica Barnes led an air assault team that fast-roped from helicopters onto rooftops, establishing elevated firing positions that commanded key intersections. Her snipers, including the exceptional Sergeant Nicole Price, began the methodical work of clearing streets from above, their suppressed rifles picking off infected with barely a sound. Price had developed a rhythm over the past week, her breathing steady and her aim true as she placed shot after shot into skulls with mechanical efficiency. Between her position and the next rooftop, Specialist Lucas Bennett operated a drone equipped with speakers, broadcasting recorded gunfire sounds to lure infected into kill zones where they could be eliminated en masse. The tactic was proving devastatingly effective, and Barnes radioed coordinates to artillery units positioned miles away, calling in precision strikes on the densest concentrations of undead. On the ground, Lieutenant Jake Morrison's infantry platoon moved through buildings like ghosts, clearing rooms and hallways with tactics adapted from urban warfare doctrine. Private Isabella Rodriguez had transformed from a nervous soldier into a hardened veteran, her movements sure and confident as she checked corners and covered her squad's advance. They moved in near silence, using bladed weapons whenever possible to avoid attracting attention, and the combat knives and machetes they carried had become as essential as their firearms. Staff Sergeant Patricia Coleman coordinated the advance, her tactical experience invaluable as they navigated the maze of offices, apartments, and shops that comprised Philadelphia's downtown corridor. Each building they cleared was marked with spray paint, a growing trail of reclaimed territory that represented hope in physical form. The Marine contingent, led by Captain Robert Chen, operated as a rapid reaction force, responding to breakthroughs and emergencies across the operational zone. Chen's Marines had earned a reputation for fearlessness, moving into situations that would make other units hesitate, and their aggressive tactics were turning the tide in multiple sectors. When Morrison's platoon encountered a pocket of over 300 infected trapped in a parking garage, Chen's team arrived within minutes, using incendiary grenades to create a controlled burn that eliminated the threat without expending precious ammunition. The flames attracted more infected, and Chen's Marines established a perimeter around the garage, methodically eliminating every undead that stumbled toward the fire like moths to a deadly lamp. By mid-afternoon, the corridor to City Hall was nearly complete, and General Bradford watched the progress from the Pentagon with cautious satisfaction. The military had adapted to fighting an unconventional enemy with remarkable speed, developing tactics that combined overwhelming firepower with psychological warfare designed for an enemy that operated on pure instinct. Major Christina Wells coordinated the second phase of operations, deploying engineering units to erect permanent barriers that would divide the infected population into manageable segments. Private Daniel Harper, who had survived the desperate fighting on the original perimeter, now operated a bulldozer, pushing wrecked vehicles and debris into barriers that would channel infected movement into predetermined kill zones. As sunset approached, Colonel Reeves allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. The counteroffensive had exceeded expectations, with military forces reclaiming nearly 8 square miles of territory and eliminating an estimated 20,000 infected at the cost of only 11 soldiers killed in action. Medic Travis Montgomery worked tirelessly in a field hospital established in a reclaimed office building, treating the wounded and marveling at the fact that they had suffered no new infection casualties thanks to improved protective protocols and rapid response procedures. The tide was turning, and for the first time since the outbreak began, soldiers were speaking about victory not as a desperate hope but as an achievable objective. Lieutenant Ashley Turner stood atop her Bradley fighting vehicle, looking at the American flag her crew had raised over a reclaimed intersection, and she knew that they were writing a new chapter in military history, one hard-won block at a time. The mission briefing at 0200 hours was classified above top secret, and the 12 soldiers gathered in the secure room represented the most elite fighting force the military could assemble on short notice. Major Vincent Drake commanded the Special Operations Team, his weathered face revealing nothing as Colonel Reeves explained the objective that would send them into the deepest part of the infected zone. Dr. Gregory Walsh stood beside a digital map of Philadelphia, pointing to a research facility near the University of Pennsylvania where Dr. Benjamin Cross had been working on experimental neurological treatments before the outbreak. Intelligence suggested that Cross's research might hold the key to understanding and possibly reversing the infection, but the facility sat in a sector where infected concentration exceeded 10,000 per square mile, making conventional military approach impossible. Drake listened without expression, already calculating insertion routes and extraction contingencies for what everyone in the room knew was essentially a suicide mission. The team inserted via helicopter at 0430 hours, fast roping onto the roof of a hospital 6 blocks from the target facility while dawn was still an hour away. Staff Sergeant William Foster, Drake's second-in-command and no relation to the other Fosters serving in the operation, secured the rooftop perimeter while the rest of the team established their equipment cache. The soldiers moved with practiced silence, their specialized gear including suppressed weapons, night vision equipment, and enough cutting-edge military technology to make them nearly invisible to the primitive senses of the infected. Sergeant Thomas Riley checked the motion sensors they would deploy along their route, small devices that would alert them to infected movement and potentially save their lives in the claustrophobic confines of the urban nightmare below. Corporal Amanda Mitchell descended the stairwell first, her footsteps utterly silent on the concrete steps as she cleared each landing with her suppressed carbine ready. Behind her, Specialist Brandon Hughes monitored a handheld device displaying thermal signatures in the building, counting 18 infected scattered across the hospital's lower floors. The team moved like shadows, bypassing the infected entirely through careful route selection and patient movement, and within 20 minutes they had exited the hospital and entered the maze of streets between them and their objective. The city in darkness was somehow worse than in daylight, the shadows hiding countless dangers and every sound magnified by the oppressive silence that had fallen over what was once a vibrant metropolitan area. They encountered their first major obstacle 3 blocks from the target when Private Nathan Cross, ironically sharing a last name with the scientist they were sent to find, spotted a gathering of infected blocking the most direct route. Drake made the tactical decision to go underground, leading his team into the subway system where Sergeant Patricia Coleman's squad had faced infected emerging days earlier. The tunnels were pitch black and reeking of death, their night vision goggles turning the darkness into a green-tinted hellscape where infected wandered aimlessly through abandoned stations. Technical Sergeant Maria Vasquez, the team's demolitions expert, planted shaped charges at strategic points as they moved, creating a potential escape route if their primary extraction plan failed. The research facility loomed before them at 0615 hours, a modern glass and steel structure that showed surprisingly little damage despite the chaos that had consumed the surrounding area. Lieutenant James Peterson, the team's technology specialist, bypassed the security systems with practiced ease, and the team slipped inside to find emergency lighting still functioning and computers still humming with backup power. Drake split the team into 3 elements, one to secure the entrance, one to establish overwatch positions, and one to accompany him to Cross's laboratory on the 4th floor. Every step deeper into the building felt like tempting fate, and Corporal Mitchell's instincts screamed warnings that she couldn't quite articulate but had learned never to ignore. They found Dr. Benjamin Cross in his laboratory, or rather they found what remained of him. The scientist had been infected but had somehow retained enough cognitive function to continue his work, filling notebooks with increasingly erratic handwriting that documented his own degradation. Staff Sergeant Foster discovered Cross in a locked storage room, the infected scientist having apparently barricaded himself inside to prevent harming others. Cross lunged at the door when it opened, and Drake made the split-second decision that ended the doctor's tormented existence with a single suppressed shot. Private Nathan Cross, shaken by the sight of a man sharing his surname reduced to a monster, began gathering the research materials while Specialist Hughes downloaded data from the laboratory computers. The alarm that shattered the silence came from Riley's motion sensors, indicating massive infected movement converging on their position. Someone or something had alerted the horde to their presence, and Drake's carefully planned stealth mission transformed instantly into a desperate fighting retreat. The team moved with disciplined urgency, carrying cases of research materials while infected poured into the building from every entrance. Vasquez detonated the first set of charges, collapsing a stairwell behind them and buying precious seconds as they fought their way to the roof extraction point. Drake radioed for immediate evacuation, knowing that every moment of delay increased the odds that none of them would leave Philadelphia alive. The sound of helicopter rotors had never been more beautiful than when the extraction birds appeared over the skyline, their door gunners laying down suppressive fire as the special operations team prepared for the most dangerous phase of any mission, getting home. The extraction helicopters descended into hell itself as Major Vincent Drake's team fought their way across the rooftop while thousands of infected swarmed through the research facility below. Sergeant Thomas Riley laid down suppressive fire at the stairwell entrance, his rifle barrel glowing hot as infected bodies piled up in a grotesque barrier that barely slowed the tide behind them. Corporal Amanda Mitchell took a hit when an infected researcher grabbed her ankle through a rooftop access vent, but Staff Sergeant William Foster pulled her free before teeth could break skin, and Specialist Brandon Hughes put the creature down with a precise shot that sent brain matter spattering across the concrete. The team loaded onto the helicopters with infected hands grasping at the skids, and door gunner Sergeant Kevin Murphy continued firing until the aircraft cleared the rooftop by 300 feet, his face grim as he watched the facility disappear beneath a sea of undead bodies. Dr. Gregory Walsh received Dr. Cross's research at 0800 hours, and what he found in those blood-stained notebooks changed everything. Cross had identified a weakness in the virus's structure, a vulnerability that could be exploited not with a cure but with a targeted biological agent that would break down the reanimated tissue at a cellular level. Within 12 hours, Walsh's team had synthesized a prototype compound, and within 24 hours, military chemical units were loading artillery shells with a substance that soldiers were already calling Lazarus solution. General Thomas Bradford authorized the deployment with full understanding that they were using an untested biological weapon on American soil, but the alternative was allowing the infection to remain a permanent threat that could resurge at any moment. The final battle for Philadelphia would be won not just with bullets and courage, but with science turning the enemy's own nature against them. Operation Final Dawn commenced on day 14 of the outbreak, and every available military asset converged on Philadelphia for a coordinated assault that would either reclaim the city or die trying. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb coordinated the massive operation from a command center that hummed with controlled intensity as thousands of soldiers moved into attack positions. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Artillery would saturate the densest infected concentrations with Lazarus solution while ground forces pressed forward in a tightening circle, eliminating scattered infected and securing territory block by bloody block. Captain Eric Donovan, who had fought since the outbreak's first hours, led his battle-hardened troops forward with quiet determination, and the soldiers who followed him had survived enough horror to believe they could survive anything. The artillery barrage began at noon, shells whistling overhead before impacting in the heart of the infected zone with muffled explosions that seemed almost anticlimactic until the effects became visible. Lieutenant Jake Morrison watched through binoculars as infected began collapsing en masse, their reanimated bodies breaking down as the Lazarus solution did its work. The compound didn't kill instantly but rendered the infected immobile within minutes, their decaying nervous systems finally surrendering to the death they had defied for 2 weeks. Specialist Isabella Rodriguez, standing beside Morrison, whispered a prayer of thanks as the nightmare creatures that had killed so many finally fell silent and still. The ground assault met resistance from infected not yet affected by the chemical agent, and the fighting remained brutal despite the turning tide. Major Kyle Hendricks's armored column punched through to City Hall by 1500 hours, and soldiers who had retreated in desperate circumstances 2 weeks earlier now raised the American flag over the building with tears streaming down their faces. Sergeant Nicole Price provided overwatch from a high-rise office building, her sniper rifle accounting for 63 confirmed kills before the sector was declared clear. Captain Jessica Barnes coordinated air support that eliminated the last major concentrations of infected, and by sunset, the battle was effectively over. The cost of victory was staggering when Colonel Janet Reeves reviewed the final casualty reports. 217 military personnel killed in action, over 500 wounded, and civilian deaths estimated at 78,000 souls who would never see their families again. Safe Zone Alpha held 42,000 survivors, displaced people who would need to rebuild lives shattered by unimaginable tragedy. Private Daniel Harper walked through the reclaimed streets, seeing the scope of destruction with new eyes and wondering how long it would take to erase the scars, both physical and psychological, that the outbreak had carved into the nation's heart. 3 weeks after the first emergency call from Officer David Patterson, Philadelphia fell silent except for the sounds of cleanup crews and reconstruction teams. Dr. Walsh continued studying the virus, knowing that the outbreak had revealed humanity's vulnerability to biological threats that science barely understood. General Bradford testified before Congress, recommending the establishment of rapid response protocols and specialized military units trained specifically for unconventional biological threats. Major Vincent Drake received the Medal of Honor for his team's desperate mission, though he insisted the real heroes were the soldiers like Medic Travis Montgomery who had saved countless lives, and the ones like Lieutenant Ashley Turner who had held the line when holding seemed impossible. The war against the dead was over, but the battle to rebuild and prepare for future threats had only begun, and the survivors carried forward with the hard-won knowledge that humanity could face the darkness and emerge, battered but unbroken, into the light.